The story of D-Day is often told as a tale of perfect unity, of Allied flags flying together over the beaches of Normandy, of Eisenhower's calm leadership, of soldiers from a dozen nations fighting as one. But behind that image, before the first landing craft even touched the French coast, there was a deep fault line running through the Allied command. At its center stood one man, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery. He was Britain's most famous general, the hero of El Alamein, a man who believed that confidence and control could win any battle. But to the Americans who fought alongside him, he was something else entirely. Arrogant, patronizing, and impossible to work with. They hated his attitude, his ego, and, most of all, his D-Day plan. And yet, when the storm finally broke over Normandy, it was that same plan, the one they distrusted, that held the invasion together long enough to win. To understand why, you have to go back to late 1943, when the Allies were still deciding how to open a second front in Europe. The Americans, led by Eisenhower and the planners in Washington, wanted a direct, simple strike, cross the Channel, seize a port, and drive inland toward Paris. The British, scarred by years of brutal fighting in North Africa and Italy, were cautious. They wanted a slower build-up, more deception, more preparation. Between these two visions stood Montgomery, a man who saw himself not as a diplomat, but as a conductor of war. When he took command of the Allied ground forces for Operation Overlord in January 1944, Montgomery inherited a plan that he immediately despised. The original American draft, known as Cossack, proposed landing 3 divisions on a narrow front around Cannes. To Montgomery, that was suicide. The Germans would crush such a small lodgment before it could expand. He demanded more divisions, more beaches, more ambition. He argued that the invasion must stretch from the Cotentin Peninsula in the west all the way to the River Orne in the east, 5 beaches instead of 3. He wanted airborne landings behind both flanks, one near St. Mire-Église to secure Utah Beach, and one near Ranville to protect the British front at Sword. It was a bold, sprawling plan, but it also meant that the British would hold the eastern half of the beachhead, while the Americans would fight on the western side. That balance of power would become the seed of resentment that grew through the whole campaign. At first, the Americans admired him. Montgomery had charisma, precision, and the glow of victory from North Africa. But as the planning dragged on, admiration curdled into irritation. He lectured senior officers as if they were cadets, rewrote staff papers without asking, and dismissed American ideas with a wave of his hand. His habit of referring to U.S. generals by their first names, Omar for Bradley, Georgie for Patton, felt less like friendliness and more like condescension. In private, many American officers joked that Monty thought the war could be won by memoranda alone. But there was no denying that he worked tirelessly. He redrafted the entire invasion plan, reorganized the Army group structures, and pushed for every ounce of logistical preparation possible. Where others saw boldness, he saw mathematics, numbers of men, tanks, landing craft, supplies. He wanted nothing left to chance. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, had to balance it all: the British caution, the American impatience, and the personalities that could fill a continent. He respected Montgomery's talent, but dreaded his attitude. "He is a good soldier," Ike wrote privately, "but difficult beyond words." By May 1944, the invasion plan was ready. 5 beaches would be hit at dawn: Utah and Omaha by the Americans, Gold and Sword by the British, and Juneau by the Canadians. Above them, 3 airborne divisions would fall through the night sky. The beaches formed one continuous front, but the objectives were very different. The Americans were tasked with pushing west and cutting off the Cotentin Peninsula to capture Cherbourg, the only deep-water port within reach. The British and Canadians, on Montgomery's eastern flank, would seize the city of Cannes and hold it, drawing German armor away from the Americans. That last part was the heart of Montgomery's D-Day plan, and the reason so many Americans would come to hate it. His strategy depended on deliberate containment. He didn't intend for the British to make a dramatic breakout from the beaches. Instead, they would hold the line, fixing the German panzer divisions in place while the Americans built up strength on the western flank. When the time was right, the Americans would launch the true breakthrough, driving south through Avranches and across France. It was a plan built on patience and attrition, not glory. And that's what made it so unpopular. To Montgomery, war was an equation. To the Americans, it was momentum. They wanted to move fast, hit hard, and push through. He wanted to absorb the blows until the timing was perfect. The two philosophies could not have been more different. When the invasion fleet finally set sail on June 5th, Montgomery's confidence was absolute. He told his staff that by D+90, 90 days after the landing, the Allies would be on the Seine. He promised Eisenhower that the Germans would be drawn north to face the British, leaving the Americans to swing around like a hammer. It was a beautiful plan on paper. The question was whether it could survive contact with reality. The next morning, June 6, 1944, reality hit like a storm. At 6:30 a.m., the first waves came ashore. On Omaha Beach, the Americans were massacred by German fire. At Utah, the tide carried the landing craft off course, but paradoxically saved them from stronger defenses. The British and Canadians faced their own nightmare at Gold, Juno, and Sword, but by noon they had carved out fragile beachheads. The invasion had worked, barely. In the chaos that followed, Montgomery's plan held the line between disaster and control. His broad front approach meant that no single beach had to succeed alone. Each could support the others with naval gunfire and reinforcements. Had the invasion been narrower, as the early American drafts proposed, Omaha's failure might have doomed the entire operation. By the second day, the Allies had landed more than 150,000 men. The beachhead was thin, exposed, and constantly under counterattack, but it was alive. Montgomery moved his headquarters to a chateau near Bayou and began orchestrating the next phase. Expand, link up, and prepare for the real fight, the battle for Cannes. This was where his plan began to test the patience of every American in Normandy. For Montgomery, Cannes was the keystone. If the British held it, the Germans would be forced to commit their armored reserves there. That would keep them away from the American sector, where Bradley's First Army was preparing to drive west. But the battle for Cannes dragged on for weeks. Every inch of the city became a killing ground. British and Canadian troops fought through hedgerows, villages, and open fields under constant shelling. Progress was measured in yards. To the Americans watching from the western flank, it looked like stagnation, a British general bogged down, unwilling to risk a decisive push. Patton, still waiting impatiently in England, mocked Montgomery in his diary. "The little bastard will never get to Cannes," he wrote. Eisenhower gritted his teeth and kept the peace, knowing that public unity mattered more than private opinion. But Montgomery saw it differently. Every day, the Germans poured more tanks into the Cannes sector. Every day, they bled their best units, trying to contain the British. The 12th SS Panzer Division, the Panzerlehr Division, the 21st Panzer, all the elite formations that might have crushed the Americans to the west, were tied down in front of Cannes. By July, the British lines looked static on the map, but strategically they were doing exactly what Montgomery intended, fixing the enemy in place. When Eisenhower visited his headquarters to demand faster progress, Montgomery pointed to the maps and said quietly, "Look at where their armor is, Ike. Then look at where it isn't." What he meant was simple. The Germans were all in front of him, and not in front of the Americans. That would prove to be the decisive difference. By mid-June, the Normandy coastline had become a furnace of men and machines. Every mile of French countryside was packed with convoys, bulldozers, tanks, and field kitchens. The beaches that on D-Day had been soaked in blood were now pipelines of steel. Behind that colossal movement was one man's hand, Montgomery's. He had drawn every arrow on the map himself, insisting that every bridge, every fuel dump, every road was part of a single, unified design. But to the Americans fighting beside him, the design was starting to look like paralysis. The British were locked in front of Cannes, throwing division after division against the same belt of villages, Perriers, Tilly, Villers-Bocage, while the Americans to the west fought through the hedgerow maze towards St. Lo. Each battle felt like wading through quicksand. It was supposed to be lightning war, but it had turned into a siege. Eisenhower could feel the pressure mounting. Washington demanded progress, the newspapers demanded victories, and the soldiers demanded answers. The Allies had landed in June expecting to be in Paris by August. Instead, by July, they were still only a few miles inland. The sky thundered with artillery day and night, yet the front hardly moved. And in every headquarters tent, one name carried the blame: Montgomery. To the Americans, he seemed to move like a chess player in a knife fight, careful, deliberate, maddeningly cautious. His briefings were famous for their optimism. "The situation is satisfactory," he would begin, even when the map in front of him was a tangle of stalemates. His officers admired his confidence, but his allies heard arrogance. Patton, still pacing in England waiting for his turn, fumed that Monty was sitting on his rear while boys die. The irony was that Montgomery's caution was part of a trap, one that few could see except him. He had studied the German mind for years. He knew they would never abandon a city like Cannes without a fight, not with their pride and their armor tied up in it. He also knew that the British could afford to bleed there, because every tiger and panther that faced them was one less waiting to face the Americans. The British soldiers, of course, didn't see grand strategy. They saw fields of fire and endless shelling. They saw comrades cut down, crossing open ground that seemed to lead nowhere. They saw Cannes burning on the horizon, but never getting closer. Yet even in that grind, they noticed something strange. The Germans were breaking themselves against them. Panzer divisions that had once been unstoppable were being shredded by naval guns and Typhoon rockets. The Germans were feeding their best into the furnace, and Montgomery kept it burning. He launched attack after attack. Operations Epsom, Charnwood, and Goodwood. Each was meant to look like a breakout, each meant to convince the Germans that this was where the Allies would pour through. They responded exactly as he hoped, committing more and more reserves to the British front. Rommel and von Kluge, the German commanders, argued bitterly about how to handle it. Hitler, as always, refused withdrawal. "Hold Cannes," he ordered, "or there will be no more Normandy." And so they held, until there was nothing left to hold with. For the Americans watching from the western flank, the picture was less clear. They saw the British pinned down and believed they were carrying the real weight of the campaign. Bradley's First Army fought through hedgerow country so dense that it swallowed tanks whole. Progress was measured in fields, each bordered by earthen walls that turned every advance into a private war. The men called it the bocage hell. When they broke through one hedgerow, there was always another waiting. By July, the frustration had hardened into anger. Eisenhower's headquarters was a boiling pot of national pride and exhaustion. The Americans complained that the British press still called Montgomery the savior of Normandy. The British muttered that American recklessness would ruin everything if they weren't restrained. Ike listened to both sides and said nothing. His patience stretched thinner every day. Then, on July 19th, the storm broke over Cannes. Montgomery launched Operation Goodwood, the largest armored assault the British Army had ever attempted. Hundreds of tanks rolled east of the city, under a sky filled with Allied bombers. The ground trembled as 2,000 aircraft dropped their loads ahead of the advancing columns. The soldiers watching from the hills thought this was it, the great breakthrough. Even the Americans admitted it looked magnificent. But by evening, the offensive had stalled. The British had advanced a few miles, but at terrible cost. Hundreds of tanks destroyed, thousands of casualties. The Germans, dug into the ridgelines beyond Cannes, had held. In London and Washington, the headlines were brutal. Montgomery fails to break out. The whispers turned to fury. Even Eisenhower began to doubt him. Yet beneath that apparent failure lay success of another kind. The German High Command, convinced that Goodwood was the main Allied thrust, threw everything it had into the Cannes sector. Nearly every operational panzer division in Normandy was now facing the British. That meant the western flank, Bradley's Americans, was almost undefended. And that was exactly what Montgomery had planned from the start. In late July, while British armor feigned exhaustion, the Americans prepared a new operation, Cobra. It would begin with the most concentrated bombing in the history of the Western Front, followed by a ground assault designed to smash through the thin German line south of St. Lo. Once the gap was open, Patton's newly arrived Third Army would pour through and race across France. When Eisenhower approved Cobra, Montgomery nodded quietly. This was his moment of vindication. The entire architecture of Overlord, the broad front, the British fixation at Cannes, the steady buildup of supplies, had been designed to create this opening. The hammer was finally ready to fall. On the morning of July 25th, the sky over the American sector turned black with bombers. Waves of B-17s and B-24s released their payloads along a narrow corridor of German defenses. The earth convulsed. Even the Allied soldiers miles away felt the shock waves. Then the infantry and tanks surged forward. In 48 hours, the Germans' western flank collapsed. Their lines were shattered beyond repair. By July 31st, Patton's tanks were streaming through the breach, racing south and east toward Avranches. France was open. For the first time since D-Day, the war in the West moved with speed again. The Americans had their breakout, their glory, their revenge. But behind that triumph was the quiet framework of Montgomery's strategy. His deliberate grind had pinned the enemy long enough for the Americans to land the decisive blow. What looked like stagnation had been the setup for victory. Of course, that wasn't how most saw it at the time. To the American press and many of their generals, Cobra was an American triumph, not a British one. They said Montgomery had nearly cost the invasion with his sluggishness. They said he had been lucky that the Americans saved his plan. And in truth, Montgomery didn't help his own cause. He briefed the press as if every success were proof of his genius. He spoke of my plan, my vision, and my battle. The Americans heard arrogance again, louder than ever. But for those who studied the campaign afterward, the pattern was clear. The Normandy invasion had not been a single strike. It had been a slow squeeze. One hand held, the other punched. Montgomery's hand held. The Americans' hand punched. Together, they broke the enemy. When Can finally fell completely in late July, the British were exhausted. Their advance had cost nearly 50,000 casualties. Yet their mission had been achieved. They had anchored the German army in place, allowing the Americans to unleash mobility and speed. As the front expanded toward Paris, Montgomery sent a simple signal to Eisenhower: the enemy front is cracking. It was as understated as his critics were loud. In August, the two halves of the Allied army, British in the north, Americans in the south, met around Falaise, closing the trap that destroyed the German 7th Army. The road to Paris was open. France was liberated. The campaign that had begun with an argument between two allies ended with the greatest victory of the Western Front. And yet, even in triumph, the bitterness lingered. The Americans never forgave Montgomery's tone, and Montgomery never forgave their impatience. He believed he had been right all along, and strategically, he was. But tactically, emotionally, politically, the wounds of Normandy would never fully heal. By late August 1944, the Allies were racing east. The German army in France had collapsed faster than even the most optimistic planners expected. What had begun as a cautious beachhead had become an open highway. The Americans under Patton swept through Brittany, then pivoted east toward Seine. The British and Canadians, under Montgomery's 21st Army Group, pushed through northern France toward Belgium. Everywhere, retreating Germans left behind burnt vehicles, abandoned guns, and prisoners too exhausted to fight. The Allies had turned the tide completely. For the men on the ground, it felt like victory was inevitable. But inside the Allied High Command, a new kind of battle was beginning. One fought not with bullets, but with pride. Montgomery believed the campaign was his to finish. He had orchestrated the invasion, managed the breakout, and now, in his mind, he should direct the final thrust into Germany itself. But Eisenhower, promoted to full command of all Allied forces in Europe, had other ideas. Ike believed in what he called the broad front, a steady, even advance by all armies along a wide line from the North Sea to the Swiss border. It was slower, but it kept the Germans constantly off balance and denied them any chance to regroup. Montgomery disagreed. He wanted a single, concentrated strike, a narrow front, led by him through northern Germany and straight to Berlin. One powerful thrust, he called it. To his mind, that was the fastest way to end the war. To the Americans, it sounded like arrogance all over again. Montgomery's plan required almost all available supplies to be funneled to his forces in the north, leaving Patton's Third Army starving for fuel in the south. Patton, who already despised Monty's reserved demeanor, exploded when he heard the proposal. "He's trying to hog the glory again," he told Bradley. "The little man wants to win the war with his name on it." But Montgomery wasn't chasing fame. Not in his own mind, at least. He was chasing control. He'd seen too many wars dragged out by indecision. He wanted a clean, decisive victory. One plan, one strike, one commander. To him, Eisenhower's broad front was dilution. To Ike, Montgomery's plan was recklessness. Between those two visions lay the future of Europe. Logistics made the argument brutal. The Allied supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles to the beaches of Normandy. Every gallon of fuel, every bullet, every loaf of bread had to move by truck, rail, or pipeline. The farther the armies advanced, the thinner the supply flow became. By September, even the most aggressive commanders were forced to admit that they couldn't all move fast at once. Someone had to slow down. Eisenhower tried to divide resources evenly. Patton raged that it was madness to stop when the Germans were on the run. Montgomery wrote long, insistent memoranda arguing that history would not forgive caution. Both were right in their own ways, and both were blind to the other's truth. When Montgomery presented his grand proposal in early September to leap across the Rhine using a daring airborne operation, Eisenhower hesitated. The plan was audacious. Drop 3 airborne divisions behind enemy lines in the Netherlands to seize a chain of bridges, allowing British armor to race up a single road straight into Germany. It was called Operation Market Garden. It would be, Montgomery promised, the shortest route to Berlin. Eisenhower, weary of the stalemate between his subordinates, approved it. If it worked, it might end the war before Christmas. If it failed, it would be another scar on the Allied alliance. The operation began on September 17, 1944. From England, more than 30,000 paratroopers of the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, along with the British 1st Airborne, soared into the Dutch sky. It was the largest airborne assault in history. On the ground, the British XXX Corps began its dash north along a single highway, the infamous Hell's Highway. The goal was to link up with the paratroopers, capture the bridges over the Maas, Waal, and Rhine, and open the door to Germany's heartland. At first, it worked. The Americans captured Eindhoven and Nijmegen after fierce fighting. But at Arnhem, the final bridge over the Rhine, disaster struck. The British 1st Airborne landed too far from the objective. The German defenses were far stronger than expected, and reinforcements never made it through. The road became a slaughterhouse. Tanks jammed nose to tail along miles of open ground, vulnerable to artillery and ambush. Rain turned the fields into mud, grounding air support. The narrow front that Montgomery had insisted on became a trap. After 9 days of fighting, Arnhem fell. Of the 10,000 British paratroopers who landed, barely 2,000 made it back. The rest were dead, wounded, or captured. The operation had failed. Montgomery, uncharacteristically shaken, called it a 90% success. To Eisenhower and the Americans, it looked more like a 90% disaster. The damage went far beyond the battlefield. The trust between the Allies cracked wide open. American commanders accused Montgomery of wasting men for glory. British officers accused the Americans of starving the operation of fuel and support. The newspapers back home wrote of a bitter quarrel among friends. Behind closed doors, Eisenhower had to mediate not just a coalition, but a civil war of egos. Yet, even in failure, Market Garden proved something important. The Germans had fought with the desperation of a dying army. Their last reserves, the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions, had been thrown into the fight. They stopped Montgomery's advance, but at a terrible cost. The Reich was bleeding out. Within months, the Allies would breach the Rhine anyway, not with one thrust, but with many. For Montgomery, the aftermath was humiliation mixed with stubborn pride. He defended the operation as a necessary risk, an attempt to end the war early. "We went a bridge too far," one of his officers quipped, and the phrase stuck. The Americans took it as confirmation of what they'd always believed, that Montgomery's ego had outgrown his judgment. Eisenhower, ever diplomatic, refused to fire him. He knew that Montgomery's experience, however difficult his temperament, remained invaluable. He simply sidelined him, giving the Americans more autonomy. From then on, the British Army's role in the West gradually diminished as the U.S. juggernaut surged forward. By December, that juggernaut was tested like never before. The Germans launched their final counteroffensive in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Bulge. It caught the Americans completely off guard. Thousands were encircled, roads collapsed under snow and fire, and panic rippled through the lines. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked as if the entire Western Front might break. Eisenhower turned to the one man who had the calm for chaos: Montgomery. He put him in temporary command of the northern sector, including 2 American armies. It was an extraordinary gesture, and a dangerous one. American troops were now being commanded by the British general many of them despised. Montgomery handled the crisis with his usual mixture of control and ceremony. He reorganized the shattered front, held the key roads, and planned the counterattack that would eventually close the bulge. The Americans, recovering from the shock, fought ferociously. Together, they turned the tide once more. But when Montgomery later described the victory in a press conference, he credited himself for saving the situation. To his critics, it was another display of arrogance. To him, it was simply the truth as he saw it. Eisenhower never forgot that press conference. Nor did Patton, who spat that Monty stole the headlines while we did the work. The alliance survived only because the war was nearly over. By March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine for good. The German army crumbled. Berlin fell to the Soviets in May. The war in Europe was over. When the guns finally fell silent, the rivalry did not. The Americans emerged as the dominant military power in the West, and their patience for British lectures vanished. Montgomery, though knighted and celebrated at home, found himself increasingly isolated. His methods had worked, but his manner had alienated nearly everyone who had shared his victories. Yet history has a way of softening edges. In time, even his harshest critics admitted that without Montgomery's insistence on preparation and control, D-Day might have failed. Without his deliberate pressure at Cannes, the Germans might have crushed the Americans before Cobra. Without his reorganization during the Bulge, the front might have broken for good. He was infuriating, yes, but he was also indispensable. And that's the paradox of Bernard Law Montgomery. The Americans hated his D-Day plan because it felt cautious, unglamorous, un-American. But it worked. It worked because war isn't won by charm or popularity. It's won by patience, planning, and the ability to make others follow even when they'd rather not. By the winter of 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. Cities lay flattened, bridges blown, rivers choked with ice and wreckage. The Wehrmacht was dying but still dangerous, fighting with the madness of a cornered animal. In the West, the Allied armies stretched from the North Sea to the Vosges Mountains. More than 2 million men under Eisenhower's command. They were closer to Berlin than ever before, yet still divided by pride, politics, and supply. After the Battle of the Bulge, the front lines stabilized along the rivers of Western Germany. The Rhine loomed ahead, wide, cold, and symbolic. For centuries, it had been Germany's natural fortress. Hitler told his people it was impenetrable. To the Allies, it was the last great obstacle before the heart of the Reich. Eisenhower now faced the hardest decision of the war: how to cross it. He had Patton pushing furiously in the south, Bradley's 1st Army in the center, and Montgomery's 21st Army Group holding the northern sector. Each believed they should lead the crossing. Each sent plans, requests, and warnings that the others were too slow or too reckless. Montgomery's case was the loudest. He argued that his northern route, near Wesel, was the most direct path to the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heart. If the Allies could seize the Ruhr, the war would effectively be over. But he demanded priority in supplies, bridging equipment, and air cover, more than Eisenhower could spare. Patton, hearing this, exploded. "Monty wants the world handed to him on a silver platter," he told Bradley. "Well, let him wait. I'll cross the Rhine first." And he did. On the night of March 22, 1945, Patton's 3rd Army slipped across near Oppenheim using pontoon bridges and assault boats. It was a bold, improvised move, executed with the speed and audacity that had made Patton famous. When Eisenhower received the report the next morning, he was stunned. Patton had beaten everyone to it. The Rhine had been crossed. Montgomery, upon hearing the news, was furious. He had spent weeks preparing a grand, meticulously planned assault, Operation Plunder, involving airborne drops, massive artillery barges, and an army of engineers. Patton had done it overnight, with barely a headline's worth of warning. The contrast between their styles could not have been starker. Monty's precision versus Patton's instinct. But Montgomery pressed on. If he couldn't be first, he would be decisive. His operation launched 3 days later, on March 24th, and it was colossal. Thousands of guns opened fire across the riverbank, lighting the night sky with orange flame. In the air, more than 16,000 paratroopers of the British 6th Airborne and the American 17th Airborne Divisions dropped behind enemy lines. They landed among burning towns, scattered by wind and flak, but they held. As dawn broke, the British Second Army began crossing in amphibious vehicles and boats, engineers building bridges under fire. By nightfall, the Rhine barrier, once thought unbreachable, was shattered. The operation was a masterpiece of coordination, if not of speed. Eisenhower later admitted that Montgomery's assault, though slower, was textbook perfect. Even Patton grudgingly called it a fine show. The price had been high, but the result was final. Germany had no more rivers left to hide behind. Yet even as the armies advanced, the old resentment simmered. Montgomery's staff released a communiqué claiming that the British forces, assisted by American airborne units, have successfully crossed the Rhine. To American ears, that sounded like theft, as if the British had led and the Americans had merely helped. Bradley fumed, Patton raged, Eisenhower sighed. Once again, Monty's need for control had poisoned the victory he'd helped win. Still, the push east continued. The Allied armies spread like an unstoppable tide. Patton drove through Bavaria toward Austria. Bradley's forces rolled into central Germany. Montgomery, on the northern flank, captured the Ruhr and then pivoted toward the North Sea, cutting off tens of thousands of German troops. The fighting became chaotic and merciless. Columns of refugees clogged every road. Villages burned without orders. The once mighty German army was now a scattering of terrified boys and exhausted veterans. In early April, Eisenhower called his top commanders to a final strategy meeting in Reims. The question on everyone's mind: who would take Berlin? Montgomery, naturally, believed his northern army should go. They were closer, he argued, and better supplied. He envisioned a swift drive to the German capital, the grand finale of his career. But Eisenhower saw a bigger picture. The Soviets were already approaching Berlin from the east, only 60 miles away. To race them would mean enormous casualties and, perhaps, disaster. Ike decided instead to halt the main Allied advance at the Elbe River and let the Soviets take the city. It was a political decision more than a military one, and Montgomery hated it. He protested in telegrams, briefings, and personal letters. We could be in Berlin within days, he argued. Why stop now? But the order was firm. The Americans supported Eisenhower's caution. They were tired, and the end was in sight. The British fumed quietly but obeyed. In their hearts, many felt they had been written out of the final act. By April 1945, the war was practically over. The Allied armies met the Soviets at the Elbe on April 25th. Photographs of British and American soldiers shaking hands with Red Army troops went around the world. 10 days later, Hitler was dead. On May 8th, Germany surrendered unconditionally. After 6 years of total war, Europe was free. And yet, even on that day of triumph, the tension between the Americans and the British command didn't fade. Eisenhower received the full credit for victory, as Supreme Commander should. Patton became a legend. Bradley became a household name. Montgomery returned home to Britain as a hero, but a lonely one. His American allies respected him for his brilliance, but could never quite forgive his manner. His British subordinates admired his discipline, but sometimes feared his ego. He was a man who had been indispensable in war, but difficult in peace. In the months after victory, Montgomery wrote long, reflective memoranda defending his conduct. He reminded his critics that the D-Day plan, the one the Americans had once hated, had worked exactly as intended. The British had fixed the German armor, the Americans had broken through, and together they had destroyed the Reich. He wrote, "Teamwork wins battles, but teams need captains." It was his way of saying that unity requires leadership, even if that leadership is unpopular. Privately, Eisenhower admitted as much. "I would not have won this war without him. Ike said years later. He was difficult, yes, but his plan was sound. That was as close to reconciliation as either man would get. But among the American generals, especially Patton and Bradley, the resentment lingered for the rest of their lives. Patton, in his post-war speeches, couldn't resist mocking Montgomery's caution. "We could have been in Berlin by Christmas if Monty hadn't stopped for tea," he quipped, half in jest, half in fury. Bradley, more measured, wrote in his memoirs that Montgomery's arrogance almost equaled his tactical skill. The British public, however, saw none of that. To them, Montgomery was the calm architect of victory, the man who had beaten Rommel, planned D-Day, and crossed the Rhine. They loved him for his steadiness, his faith in the common soldier, and his refusal to waste lives for headlines. In a country still scarred by loss, he represented control, the opposite of chaos. And perhaps that was the real divide between him and the Americans. The United States fought the war with audacity and speed, confident in its growing power. Britain fought with calculation and survival, haunted by what it had already endured. Montgomery embodied that difference. To Americans, he looked like a man afraid to gamble. To Britons, he looked like the only adult in a room full of gamblers. In the end, both were right. Montgomery's D-Day plan was cautious, deliberately so. It sacrificed speed for certainty. It required patience, discipline, and faith in the long game. And for all his pride and posturing, the plan worked. It got the Allies ashore. It held the line when the enemy counterattacked. It gave Eisenhower the stable foundation from which to unleash Patton and Bradley. It was, in its quiet way, one of the greatest strategic successes in modern warfare. But Montgomery himself never quite escaped his reputation. In later years, when asked about his American counterparts, he was polite but clipped. "They were fine soldiers," he would say, "but they did not always appreciate method." To the end, he believed that victory had proven him right. To the Americans, victory had proven that his caution had merely delayed the inevitable. History, as always, sits somewhere between. When the guns finally fell silent, Europe was a graveyard of nations. The maps were redrawn, the cities shattered, and the victors already half turned toward a new kind of war, the Cold War. But the men who had led the fight still carried the weight of the old one. Among them, Bernard Law Montgomery was both triumphant and isolated. His armies had helped break the Reich, yet his relationships with the Americans were bruised beyond repair. After the surrender, Montgomery was given the honor of accepting the formal capitulation of German forces in the north. On May 4, 1945, at Lüneburg Heath, he sat at a plain wooden table as Admiral von Friedberg and his staff signed the documents that ended the fighting in Holland, Denmark, and northern Germany. The photographs show Monty looking grim, almost austere. No smile, no grand gesture. To him, it wasn't a moment for glory. It was paperwork ending something that had gone on too long. Outside, the rain fell on the fields where his soldiers were still burying the dead. Yet even in victory, he couldn't escape controversy. The American press called Eisenhower the man who beat Hitler. British papers called Montgomery the soldier who never lost. Between those two versions of history lay a canyon of pride. Eisenhower went home to parades and politics. Patton became a symbol of American aggression. Montgomery returned to Britain to the quiet applause of a nation exhausted but grateful. His welcome was respectful, not exuberant. Britain had won, but it was broke. There was no mood for celebration. Montgomery became chief of the Imperial General Staff, the highest professional post in the British Army. He tried to reform it with the same precision he had imposed on the battlefield: stricter training, clearer planning, fewer committees. But in peacetime, his bluntness didn't inspire fear or loyalty the way it had in war. Ministers resented his interference. Younger officers chafed at his lectures. The same personality that had driven armies forward now drove colleagues away. Across the Atlantic, Eisenhower moved in the opposite direction, from general to statesman. In 1951, he became the first supreme Allied commander Europe for NATO. Ironically, one of his deputies was Montgomery. For the first time since the war, they share an office again. The atmosphere was formal, courteous, and ice-cold. Eisenhower's easy charm filled conference halls. Montgomery's clipped efficiency filled memoranda. The two men respected each other's competence, but never again shared trust. When Ike later ran for president, Montgomery sent him a brief note of congratulations. Nothing more. Still, the world kept turning, and history began to soften the outlines of the war's quarrels. By the 1960s, when veterans gathered at reunions and the first documentaries appeared on television, the arguments of 1944 sounded almost antique. Younger historians, with access to archives and German records, started to see the larger picture that the men themselves could not. That Montgomery's D-Day plan, the one mocked for its slowness, had actually been the linchpin of Allied victory. They pointed out that the wide five-beach landing scheme had prevented a catastrophe on Omaha, that his insistence on drawing German armor toward can had allowed the Americans to punch through its St. Lo, that the deliberate, methodical buildup of supplies before Cobra had turned a risky foothold into a fortress. In hindsight, the cautious plan looked less like hesitation and more like strategic foresight. He hadn't aimed to win in a week. He'd aimed to make defeat impossible. Even some of his critics began to concede it. Bradley, in his later years, told an interviewer, "Monty was slow, but he was thorough. We needed that." Patton, had he lived longer than 1945, might never have agreed, but Bradley's acknowledgment carried weight. Eisenhower himself, in his memoirs, wrote that Montgomery's tactical sense was unerring. His trouble was temperament, not intellect. That line became the verdict of history, the right man with the wrong manner. For Montgomery, vindication came quietly. He published his own memoirs in 1958, dry, exact, and unapologetic. In them he wrote that the object of D-Day had not been to reach Paris quickly, but to destroy the German army in the field. "Speed is desirable," he said, "but certainty is essential." Critics accused him of rewriting history. Others saw only the same unbending clarity that had defined him in war. At home, he lived modestly in Hampshire, among the trophies and papers of a lifetime. He drove an old car, lectured at military colleges, and corresponded with soldiers who had served under him. They adored him still. Many wrote that his discipline had saved their lives. He never forgot them. Every year on June 6th, he sent messages to the surviving divisions that had landed in Normandy. "You were the bravest of the brave," he told them. "It was my honor to serve with you." By the time of his death in 1976, the war he had helped win was part of legend. On both sides of the Atlantic, the veterans were old men. The quarrels of generals had faded into footnotes. In the museums and documentaries, Montgomery appeared as a figure carved in the marble of victory, stern, precise, unmistakably British. The younger generation knew little of the feuds that had once defined him. They saw only the calm man in the beret, standing before maps covered in pins, explaining the plan that had carried 500,000 men across the Channel. And perhaps that's how he would have wanted it. He always believed that results mattered more than popularity. "Leadership," he once said, "is the ability to get men to do what must be done, even if they don't like you for it." No sentence better sums up his war. When historians today revisit D-Day, they often begin with the same question: could anyone else have made it work? The consensus, even among American scholars, is increasingly no. Eisenhower gave the vision, but Montgomery turned it into geometry. The spacing of beaches, the sequencing of landings, the timing of the breakout. He forced the invasion to be big enough to survive its own mistakes. In doing so, he saved it. The Americans still grumbled that he lacked flair. The British still grumbled that the Americans stole the headlines. But in the long view, their tension became part of the strength of the alliance. One side supplied the daring, the other the discipline. Between them lay balance, the secret ingredient of victory. Montgomery never apologized for being himself. He didn't need to. His D-Day plan had worked exactly as he'd said it would. Hold in the East, break in the West, destroy the enemy. The men who once cursed his name lived to go home because of it. The Americans hated his plan because it looked slow, but it was built to win slowly and then never lose again. In the years after 1945, the world that Montgomery had known dissolved like smoke. Empires shrank, new nations rose, and the great armies of the war scattered back into civilian life. But Montgomery never really left the battlefield. He remained a soldier even in peace, a man defined by order, discipline, and memory. At first, Britain celebrated him as the hero who had stood between the nation and disaster. The newspapers called him the soldier's general. He was made Viscount Montgomery of Alamein and stood in the House of Lords beside Churchill. He gave speeches about leadership, education, and moral courage. His words were clipped, precise, almost biblical in rhythm. "There are no bad soldiers," he told the crowd at Sandhurst, "only bad generals." For the men who had followed him through the deserts and the hedgerows, that single sentence felt like a medal. But Britain was changing. The country that had once lived for its army now wanted peace, comfort, and welfare. Young men looked to universities and factories instead of the parade ground. To them, Montgomery's world of discipline and duty seemed antique. He became, in the public imagination, part of the black and white film reel of history, forever frozen in his beret, pointing at a map no one could see. For the veterans, however, his presence remained personal. In regimental reunions and small-town memorials, they spoke of him with a mixture of awe and irritation. He had been infuriating, yes, demanding to the point of cruelty, but he had kept them alive. "You cursed him every day," one sergeant wrote, "and thanked him every night." They remembered his inspections before battle, the way he would stop to adjust a man's helmet strap or ask if the rations were hot. It wasn't warmth, it was precision. He believed that the smallest detail could decide a campaign. For the men who survived Normandy, it had. His relationship with his peers never healed. Eisenhower remained cordial but distant. Patton dead in 1945, Bradley politely dismissive. When American officers visited Britain in the 1950s, they treated Monty with respect, but rarely with affection. The old jokes lingered, about his ego, his slow pace, his love of publicity. Yet privately, many of them admitted that he had been right about the essentials, that D-Day required discipline more than daring, and that wars are won by logistics, not rhetoric. Montgomery himself was aware of the caricature that surrounded him. He called it the price of victory. In his papers he wrote, "A commander who is loved is lucky. A commander who is obeyed is successful." He had never set out to be liked. He had set out to win, and in that, his record was almost unmatched. In 1948, he toured the battlefields of Europe for the first time since the war. Normandy had changed. The fields were green again, the towns rebuilt, the graves white and silent. He visited Caen, where so many of his soldiers lay buried. Local children followed him, asking for autographs, unaware that this quiet old man had once commanded millions. At the British cemetery, he stood for a long time before the headstones and said only they were the finest. A journalist asked him later if he regretted the slowness of his campaign there. "No," he replied. "We took the time to do it properly." They deserved nothing less. As the decades passed, historians began to see the patterns more clearly. They compared the casualty rates of Montgomery's armies with those of other Allied commanders. The numbers told a different story. His divisions lost fewer men per mile advanced than almost any other in Europe. His caution, which critics had once mocked, now looked like responsibility. In the brutal arithmetic of war, restraint had saved lives. German officers who survived the conflict offered their own grudging respect. General Bayerlein, who had commanded Panzerlehr at Caen, later said that Montgomery's constant pressure had been a hammer on the anvil. He meant that it broke their will slowly, methodically, without pause. Another, General von Manschenfeld, told an interviewer in 1956, "Montgomery understood our army. He fought it like an engineer dismantling a machine, piece by piece." Coming from a man who had fought on both fronts, that was perhaps the highest compliment. Montgomery took little interest in praise. He was more concerned with teaching. In his retirement, he wrote lectures on leadership that became standard reading for British cadets. His notes are still studied today, clear, simple, and relentlessly practical. "The most important quality in a commander," he wrote, "is balance, the ability to act boldly but think calmly." It was, perhaps, the best description of himself that he ever gave. He also became a kind of moral voice for veterans. In the 1960s, when younger historians began to romanticize war, Monty rejected it outright. "War is not adventure," he said at a commemoration in Portsmouth. "It is organized murder." We did it because we had to, not because we wanted to. The audience, old soldiers in worn uniforms, rose to their feet. To them, the man who had once demanded perfection now sounded like a conscience. Even his relationship with the Americans mellowed with time. In 1969, during a visit by Dwight Eisenhower's widow, Mamie, Montgomery received her at his home in Islington. They sat by the fire for an hour. At one point, she said softly, "Ike always said you were the best planner he ever met." Montgomery looked at the fire and nodded. "He was the best diplomat I ever served under," he replied. It was the closest thing to peace the two men ever reached. When he died in 1976, aged 88, the tributes came from every corner of the world. The Queen sent condolences. The American ambassador attended the funeral in Winchester Cathedral. Old veterans lined the streets, saluting as his coffin passed. On it rested his field marshal's baton and the same black beret he had worn on D-Day. The inscription on his grave was plain: Bernard Law Montgomery, 1887 to 1976. Soldier. In the decades since, historians have continued to argue about him. Some call him Britain's last great general. Others call him a relic of another age. But almost all agree on one thing: the invasion of Europe could not have succeeded without him. His insistence on preparation, his broad front logic, his understanding of morale and logistics. These were the bones on which victory was built. The Americans had hated his plan because it didn't look heroic. It wasn't designed for glory. It was designed to work. And in the end, it did. The British held. The Americans broke through. The Allies won. That, stripped of ego and politics, is Montgomery's true legacy. Proof that leadership is not about popularity, but about clarity. In a war filled with personalities larger than life, Patton's fury, Eisenhower's charm, Churchill's thunder, Montgomery's power was quiet. He was the voice of method in a storm of emotion. He gave the invasion something rarer than courage, structure. And perhaps that is why, 80 years later, when military academies teach D-Day, they still study the plan that everyone once doubted. They don't call it reckless or timid anymore. They call it professional. Montgomery's name still divides opinion, but his work doesn't. His D-Day plan, the one the Americans hated, became the blueprint for every major amphibious operation that followed, from Korea to the Falklands to modern coalition wars. His belief that multinational armies could fight as one under strict coordination became the very principle of NATO. Even his critics, reading the documents now yellow with age, concede that his approach saved tens of thousands of lives. For a man who never cared about being liked, that is the greatest vindication of all.